and welcome to the Temple of Wisdom. We are Logic and Reason. I am your co-host, Logical Troglodyte, along with my good friend, Steaming Cup of Reason, Jeff.
Good morning, everyone. How are you doing today? I hope you're going to enjoy the show. We've got a really great one lined up for you. I'd like to begin by introducing our first guest. We're quite pleased and honored to have him with us today, Professor Phil Bell. Say hello, Professor.
Hi. How do you do? And good morning in the States, and for anybody in Australia, a very late good evening.
Good morning, Dr. Phil, and we appreciate you joining us. And returning with us as a guest is engineer Mike Bertelson.
Good morning or afternoon, evening, wherever you happen to be. It's good to be on again.
And keeping us everything rolling well in the background is our chief mod, Amy Hogan. Good morning, Amy.
Good morning. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, wherever you are. I'm happy to be here this morning.
And running all of our whistles and bells and dials to make sure our stream is not interrupted, Teddy Bogle.
All right, troops, how's it going? I have to say, having listened to the chat pre-show, this is going to be fantastic. Enjoy this one.
Thanks. And we are gathered together this morning in the Temple of Wisdom, called on by the Olympians as their champions to fight in the conspiracy wars. Today, we are discussing the conspiracy claim that satellites are fake. Before we get started, a little light housekeeping. Anybody in the live chat who has mod wrenches, please understand that if conspiracy theorists pop in, we're perfectly okay with that. Do not erase their messages, time them out, or boot them unless they are being really out there, as in racist, homophobic, nasty personal attacks. Anything else, fair game. We may even address some of their questions, comments, or concerns as long as their questions, comments, and concerns are on topic. We will not be arguing unrelated topics this morning. If anyone in the live chat has any questions or comments for the panel, please address them to at Logic and Reason. Amy Hogan is logged in under that moniker, and she will bring that to our attention. With that, let's get started in this conversation. I thought I'd open by asking the panel the question, what is it about the conspiracy claim that satellites are fake that is the most concerning to you? Dr. Phil?
Well, we have about 3,000 people directly working in just to get those satellites into orbit. And these are dedicated people, scientists, engineers, lay people, technicians, all these people working together to do that. And basically what the flat earth people are saying is they discount not just the collective knowledge, but this collective work that we do to make that happen. It's hard to ignore.
Yeah, absolutely. And Mr. Bertelson?
I feel along the same lines. It's sort of, it denies all of ingenuity and engineering and science and physics that we've accomplished up until this point in our history, and so limits the potential that we have of going forward, traveling beyond our own moon orbit and exploring the rest of the solar system and eventually the galaxy. It's very limiting, and it is very much denies our level of curiosity and wanting to learn and explore. It's who we are as a people. It denies the very basic facts of who human beings are.
No, very good. And, what about you, Jeff?
Well, I think to kind of carry on from what Mike was saying, for me, the most concerning thing about it is just the absolute abundance of evidence out there for the satellites that we have, and the ease at which people can find that evidence and verify it. And yet they openly and willfully deny that evidence. That, to me, is the most concerning thing about it.
I think for me, it's sort of along the same lines as the rest of y'all. It's that arrogance that says, I know more than you, even though you may be the highly educated expert. It's the idea that we've been exploring the technology and trying to reach out above our own world since the 1950s when they first launched Sputnik, and all the advances that we've made since then. They're just totally denying all the thousands and thousands of people and all the millions of man hours that have worked on coming up with the idea, designing, testing, launching, and working toward their life goal, which is the enrichment of human knowledge, and saying no, it's got to go. It doesn't fit my narrative, so what I would like to do in this show is try to show the conspiracy theorists that yes, satellites are real, space is real. Come along with us and let's work together in expanding the frontiers of human knowledge. And to that end, how would we begin the rest of this conversation, guys?
Well, I'd like to start, if you don't mind, by saying that, and to reiterate something that I've said before, and that is that I'm not here, and I presume I speak for you too. I'm not here to mock flat Earth people who believe that the Earth is flat, or indeed the people who think that satellites don't exist. So I'm a professional educator, and in our books, there's no dumb question. Okay, so what I'd like to do is to confront the questions that flat Earth people have, or those people who denied satellites. Confront those questions, and show them how satellites, how their position is impossible, basically, given what we know and given the evidence that's available.
Yes, we completely agree on this show. We try not to mock conspiracy theorists. We try to educate them to the best of our ability, which is why we call on experts such as Mike and Professor Phil. Excuse me. And so I think one of the things that conspiracy theorists will say when it comes to satellites are fake is that I think in general they're concerned with a worldview that if the world and the universe is as big as we're discovering it, what does that mean for me? And am I way too small and way too insignificant for the rest of the universe? I think that's a good place to start.
Well, someone else like to go first? I don't mind.
Well, I would certainly agree with Logical on that. The sheer magnitude of space exploration in the universe that we live in can be quite humbling and can make us feel extremely insignificant. But I think that it's not a really big effort to look at it from another perspective. We are significant in our part of it all. And as long as we hold true to that and continue to grow and expand, I don't see why we should feel so small about anything. I find that I feel kind of big being part of it all.
Yeah, and I kind of agree with that. I don't fear my own insignificance in the grand scale of the universe. In fact, to the best of our knowledge, not to say that the contrary isn't true, but to the best of our knowledge, we're the only self-aware, intelligent race so far. And given that, to me, the vastness of the universe, although might make me small and insignificant in the grand scale of things, makes our lives, individually and collectively, much more precious.
I think we also need to understand that this is a hot button issue for a lot of conspiracy theorists, globe denying conspiracy theorists, because if satellites exist, then space exists, and their view of what they believe starts to become out of focus for them. So I think it's important for us to understand why this is a problem for people who believe that the Earth is flat.
Yes, I think you're being kind by saying out of focus, but nevertheless, look, I think I've lost my train of thought now. Oh yes, look. First of all, there's this religious aspect to it, and that is, this book says one thing, and we are duty bound to believe what this book says, and therefore there cannot be, it's impossible for there to be anything that contradicts it. So therefore, the faith that they have, that we can't, us scientists can't be right because the book has to be right. And that's one of the issues that they have. I think that's probably, I think as mentioned before, that's probably the biggest issue that they have with this.
Yeah, and one of the things that they're failing to recognize is that there are a lot of religious people within the scientific community. Mr. Bertelson, that is with us today, I know he's a very devout religious man. Most of the people in the audience who know me know that I am not, but yet Mike and I, we get along just fine regardless of our religious beliefs, because we understand that what connects us is the science. Mike, do you have anything to say about that?
No, I agree with you. I mean, I don't know that I would call myself exceptionally devout or anything, but you know, I am a Christian, and I don't find there is any conflict between religious belief and science. You know, so
I think it's easy to forget that that the people I work with, just have a look at the 3,000 people that I work with. To a person, they would have about 1,000 gods each. So these people are extremely devout religious people, and yet they can accept the fact that our cosmology is the way it is, and their religion is something else. These things don't have to conflict with each other. And that is because their religion isn't making specific claims about how the universe works. There isn't a book that says, this is how the stars work, this is how the sun works. This isn't the job of the religion. The job of the religion is to address the spiritual needs of the person. You know, perhaps even look back to the ancestry, or even if they believe in reincarnation and the like. But this has nothing to do with the physical aspects of our universe. Their religion doesn't address those things. And why not?
And that kind of brings us to the subject at hand. It's about evidence. There is overwhelming evidence, verifiable evidence, and predictive evidence of satellites. And satellite TV is probably one of the easiest ways to look at things and figure out that, you know, there are millions of people worldwide that have, you know, some sort of direct broadcast satellite on little dishes, and, you know, they're pointing all at the same spot in the sky. Unless you're talking about the Earth being flat, then they don't.
Yeah, exactly. And before we start getting into specific evidences for the existence of satellites, I'd like to turn to Amy Hogan and have her enlighten us as to what's going on in the live chat. Amy?
Yes, I have a couple comments here that are really good. Gerard says, what is the success rate educating these reality deniers? How many have changed their mind? I think they think pretty much none, because their mind is just closed for anything that goes against their narrative. And then Ugly German Truth says, but in some ways that is a bad thing. If the book made more claims you can outright disprove, the conflict would probably not be carried along by so many. The Fill Your Gaps Yourself writing helps encourage those that make up their own alternative truth model of reality.
Nicely said, actually.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And actually, I think there are some who have, that I have met since I have started my YouTube channel, that have switched camps from conspiracy theorists to science proponents. I've met a couple, not many, but we have to remember that there's many different kinds of conspiracy theorists. There are those who really just don't have the education, recognize they don't have the education, and once we reach out in a kind way and help them understand, they get it and they come along with us for the ride. Then there's those who just for whatever reason might be slightly paranoid, or or way too literal in their interpretation of their holy text, and they say nope, and anything that contradicts this I cannot believe, I will not believe. And then there are those who I call the charlatans, who are just out there to make a few bucks off the gullible, sell some t-shirts and whatnot. And the latter two, unfortunately, we're going to have a difficult time bringing along back into the reality along with us.
Yeah, I think I know of about 4 people off the top of my head that have done a 180 and realized that the Earth isn't flat, and they have come back to understanding science as we do understand it. And I think that though most would resist to the very end the possibility that they're wrong on that subject, I think I don't know about anyone else, but I'm more interested in getting to those that are maybe sitting on the fence and don't realize or understand what they're trying to research, and maybe help them understand the reality as we understand it today.
I'm of the same thinking. I think it's the fence sitters most of all that are vulnerable, and it's our job as educators, myself, to get to them before the flat earthers do, and educate them and help them to see the truth.
Yep, which is exactly why Jeff and I decided to start this show. Before we move on to specific evidences, Professor Bell, do you have anything to add to this part of the conversation?
Yes, well, first of all, there's been quite a lot of research done into commenters and lurkers. And the research shows there's about 9 lurkers for every 10 people who view the video. So people who will just view it and not comment at all. And based on that and the amount of views, the amount of likes, the amount of clicks, it seems to be that most people will look at a video and then I believe they realize that the flat earth stuff is nonsense. So I think the people who are out there like this channel, who are actually making these comments, are actually doing a service. My biggest issue with this is, so for me to spend some time doing this in the middle of exams is stuff, you can imagine how busy this is, 400 students. My biggest thing is those people who join Flat Earth end up in a gateway to the other conspiracies that are actually harmful. So this will be, anti-vaccines and the like. These conspiracy theories actually are, if you like, an existential risk to the rest of us, and this is concerning. So if we can stop the people from saying, "Look, this flat Earth stuff is nonsense. It's another conspiracy theory," and just like with as little evidence as the other conspiracy theories have, so. You don't have to actually invest in this. It's pretty much a cult now, because I can't believe that the people who are reasonably intelligent can't look at the evidence and say, hang on a second, we must have this wrong. I mean, there's some very, very, let alone satellites, there's some basic things like explain night and day without a magic lampshade. That alone is a question every flat earth person should be asking themselves. And when they do, that should be a big red flag.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And I know we'll probably, during the course of the show, start to get very technical about satellites, rocketry, space exploration, and all that. But before we get too deep into the technical aspects, for the layman who maybe have just a high school education or some college, who may not have graduated college or not have studied physics and mathematics specifically, what do you guys all think is the main pieces of evidence that can prove to those laymen that satellites and space exploration in general is real?
Okay. I'll start off here. Well, first of all, I try not to have that word proof and science mixed together. It tends to come with truth and proof, and they're not really compatible with science. So if we just start from that premise, let's call the stuff that we have overwhelming evidence. Okay. So probably if you consider that I would say at least once a week somewhere around the world, some agency is launching a satellite. This costs anywhere from $200 to $600 million to get up there when you take into account fuel, rocket, oxidizer, the spaceship itself, the manpower that goes into it, and then the cargo, the payload. If you had to fake it, you'd fake it once or twice. Why do you have to fake it every week? That surely another intelligent person's got to ask themselves, hang on a second, they must be doing something, because this is so much money. Why are they ditching this in the $600 million every week in the Bermuda Triangle, or wherever they think that these rockets get to? Why do they keep doing it? Why don't they just do it once or twice and say, oh, look what's happened, rockets are in space, and then leave it alone? But they keep wasting all of this money. That is just so profoundly silly.
Well, actually, you just put me in mind of a conspiracy theorist that I watched in the last few days, who was basically saying that the space programs are a jobs welfare program for the college educated, that those programs were taking monies away from people in need, parts of the world who are going hungry, undereducated, underclothed, and underfed. Therefore, everything that those space agencies is doing is fake, and it's all just a conspiracy to keep the rest of the world kind of down under the heel of the first world countries, basically is what it's saying. How would you address that particular conspiracy theorist who's saying that?
Well, there's a couple of things that don't make sense in their conspiracy theory, and that is, first of all, this is a huge amount of money. That's one. Secondly, let's say that none of that money was spent. Would that money then go to these people they talk about, or would it just buy other things, other consumables for those countries that have this kind of resource that they have? Many satellites are private enterprise. Many satellites are military. Would those people with that money in their budget spend it on the poor and the needy in third world countries? I doubt it. So that doesn't even make sense from that point of view. So they're saying it could feed the needy. Well, no, even if you had it, it wouldn't. And in fact, there is enough money to feed the needy. It's just that the people who have it are choosing not to. So that's that part of it is a nonsense. One, the repetition of it. Two, that part of it. Three, how many people have to keep this secret? That's the other one.
Oh yeah, Mike.
And I find myself wanting to ask people like that is, what evidence do you have for such a theory? Most of these conspiracy theories and most of these so-called explanations to explain what they think they observe in the world around them don't come with any evidence. They're thought experiments more than anything else that they just made up out of whole cloth. And I think that it behooves us to start asking for evidences of any of these conspiracies that they come up with, or any of these explanations, even for, like relative density or any of those other silly ideas that they have. Where is the evidence?
I don't think evidence matters to them, actually, to be honest.
I agree with you on that, and it really doesn't matter to them. But nobody really spends the time to press them to answer those questions, and they would never do answer those questions in an open form of discussion such as this. It's usually in their comment section, someone will start to ask those questions, and then they'll get ignored and then blocked from being able to comment further.
I agree with you, and I think mocking them does a disservice, actually.
Yeah. And for them to say things like it's a make work project by the government to help cover up or support the lie, so to speak. I'm sorry, but when I went to college, I had to pay for that out of my pocket. The government didn't give me a dime.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sort of is kind of a weird way to look at it too, a make work project, because I know from an engineering standpoint that there are plenty of jobs in the United States right now. They're actually, the competition to find, new engineers coming out of college is pretty stiff. And, it isn't as if anybody's suffering to find work right now. So there's plenty of work out there. Just so that really doesn't even make any sense.
Yeah, and I'd like to turn to Amy. Looks like we've got some pretty good questions in the live chat section.
Absolutely,
Amy?
I do have. Yes, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, gotcha.
Okay, thank you. Gerard came back after that first line of comments that we read and said, but many, in particular Christians, still claim that the religion does make such claims. Even flat earthers that subscribe to a satellite TV service still think it is picking up signals from towers. Ugly German Truth says it's more frequent with creationism when the science is more tangible and omnipresent. A lot of debunkers that deal mostly with that kind of claims have stated that they were raised strictly YEC. Logic and Digital Demonic Davros says, is having knowledge of the globe classified as a belief? John Rapp says, my question would be, with literally thousands of rocket launches to put satellites up there, why fake it? For the love of infinity, why? And then Ugly German Truth says, it might be interesting to speak a bit with your guest about the coming Starlink system with its tens of thousands of small sats and the problems that means for space travel and astronomers.
Well, that's an interesting one. Back in February 2017, our PSLV C-37 launched 104 satellites in one payload.
Wow!
And most of these satellites were only a cubic foot, so they nanosatellites. And but it is a fair question to ask, and that is, at what stage will this will we say enough? I mean, if we need a geostationary satellite, it's got to go at 36,000 kilometers. It's not as though we can put it somewhere else. So are we crowding this space? When these things break apart, who's going to keep monitoring? I mean, there's an agency that does monitor where space junk is and needs to. But at what stage are we going to say, hang on a second, you've got to hold back. You've got to get some of this out of the way before you put new stuff there.
Absolutely. And I was completely unaware that satellites have gotten so small. A cubic foot, that's amazing.
Yeah.
And that brings me to a conspiracy claim that they use against the evidences for satellites, saying that if there's so many thousands of satellites in the sky, why can't I look up and see them? But yet I have an app on my phone called Night Sky, I think it is, that tells me when a specific satellite is going to be going overhead in my local area. It tells me all the information about who launched it, when it was launched, what its mission is, and I can compare my phone screen to the night sky and actually watch the satellite travel overhead. Now, granted, it's about the size of a small star, but there again, we fall into the conspiracy theorists seem not to understand the sense of scale.
Yeah. Well, it kind of is. There is a group of people who are into astrophotography out there who don't have any clue that there's this argument between a round Earth, a globe Earth, and a flat Earth, and they're actually, it's a matter of pride with some of them to actually get photographs of satellites, especially ones that are orbiting overhead, and they'll track them, and they'll wait for their opportunity to shoot that picture. And this is something that is if any flat earther wants to verify, can go off and do on their own. So it isn't that there are people out there who actually do take pictures of these things. You can see them with telescopes. They're not very good pictures most of the time, but they are recognizable, and you can actually identify a particular satellite sometimes.
Well, the thing is, it's quite amazing to have a time lapse photograph. You can actually see. Surely they've got to be asking, what are those streaks? And why are they going in a particular direction? For instance, in a polar satellite, going from pole to pole. Why is this one going, west around the equator, and the other one going pole to pole? What on earth is happening to up in the sky up there that these things happen? This time lapse photography would easily show them that there's something moving up there.
I think part of the problem with that is that it was not so long ago that things were less generalized, more along the lines of what people would refer to today as the Renaissance man, that a person would be an artist, a philosopher, a scientist. But now in our more modern day, as we have gained more and more knowledge, these branches have separated into very specific, general or specialized fields. So even though I have studied psychology and clinical counseling professionally, I did not have the time in my education and training to study mathematics and physics. I kind of did a little on the side, and I know some of that, but not near enough to be employed as a physicist. And I think that specialization is causing the less educated layman to say, wait a minute, why am I having to rely on what they are telling me?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, totally agree.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is also that the technology has come so far that it's become part of the problem. And by that, I mean that technologies that we take so easily for granted, like almost every vehicle you buy today has an onboard navigation system with a wonderful lady's voice speaking to you, giving you directions. But many people just take that for granted. They've disconnected that from the satellites that make that possible.
Which brings me to, great, go ahead, Doctor.
Okay, I was going to say that I was just going to bring this up because I never tried to remember this, but Maslow, Maslow's, the psychologist would know this very well, hierarchy of needs. And for instance, I think quite a lot of it sort of follows this quite well, and that is this, having got psychological needs and safety needs, out of the way, we now have people who are, for one reason or another, have chosen not to be educated, and or they were unfortunately not given any opportunities like that, and then find themselves saying, well, everything is moving so fast. Here, phones are changing every second year. Your fridge talks to you now, and they're just overwhelmed. Young people are not really all that overwhelmed because they're born with this thing. I didn't see a TV until I was 16 years old. I was born in Kenya and then moved to South Africa where they forbade TV. And for me, I was 16 by the time I got to see a television set. But nowadays, kids are born with phones practically in their hands. They're not overwhelmed by the technology. And this kind of fits in with that research that, again, in this flat Earth research that's been done, that shows that there's such a high percentage of those people are sort of in 40 and more. So mostly male and mostly more than 40. So it sort of fits in with this missed opportunity for education and feeling overwhelmed. So in Maslow's case, so I'll just sort of finish so on Maslow's hierarchy, we then have to reach this part of esteem. So this gives them the esteem, and then for those who are actually in the activist place, so those people going around Europe, for instance, I would say that they'd be trying to find this self-actualization.
Yeah, and that self-actualization is very difficult to achieve, especially when you don't have the educational opportunities that others have been afforded. And like myself, I grew up in the late 60s through the 70s, and so I watched technology progress, and I kind of kept step with it. But, my children and then my grandchildren now, they just have all that handed to them, and they don't seem to have the same drive that I had to educate myself, either formally or self. And they just kind of, since they had all this handed to them, they just kind of seem to expect it to keep being handed to them, which I kind of don't understand that mindset myself.
Yeah. Well, is there something you'd like to add to that, Mike?
No, not really. I think I'm kind of enjoying plus the humanities, the psychological aspects. I'm not really that versed on, so I don't think I can discuss that intelligently.
I think for the kids, there's no wow anymore. You can't say, oh, wow. I mean, for us, for me, watching television for the first time, that was wow, Yeah. And so the commercials were more interesting than the shows for me.
For me, it was being an 8-year-old boy gnawing on a popsicle, watching the Apollo moon missions on TV. That was the wow.
Yeah, that was the wow. Yes,
that's what I mean, and that would not. I mean, putting a spacecraft on Mars is not a big wow for this generation.
Well, that's unfortunate because that should be a wow.
Yeah, it should be.
Yeah, exactly. I remember when I was actually halfway through my undergraduate degree when calculators came out. So before that, I was using the slide rule, and so you can imagine how much wow that was.
I can remember those.
The calculator.
Yeah. Oh yeah, and but I think people today, like we said a few moments ago, tend to forget how integral satellites are to the technologies we have today and technologies that we are developing for tomorrow. And I think the general layman kind of thinks of satellite in terms of their television, and for some their telephones. But what other types of satellites and what other missions do they produce, and are they relevant to the general population?
Well, soon we have the 2020 Olympics coming up, and people worldwide will be watching that. And Soccer World Cup, people worldwide watch those. Those are transmitted worldwide the way they are in real time via satellites. I mean, you can't do it any other way. So the very act of watching a television show, a television program, is using satellite technology.
Yeah, precisely. The one of the things, I mean, I can't getting in too much into it, but obviously the military. Let's look at a polar satellite, for instance. A polar satellite travels pole to pole, just off, around about 5 degrees off, and the Earth spins beneath it. And as a result of the satellite going around the pole and the Earth spinning beneath it, this satellite gets to see every square inch of the Earth. Okay, and this is particularly important, obviously, to military organizations. They want to see what's going on. They want to pinpoint who's doing what and when. So, when they make these, when, for instance, they say, "Oh, this country did this or this country did," how on earth do they think that, without flying over them, that they find out? How do they get these photographs?
Yeah, for the most part, that is not just a blind political accusation. These satellites do give the world governments the ability to see what's going on elsewhere in the world.
And there's also satellites out there that are a huge benefit to just the general populace of the globe. I mean, SpaceX, Elon Musk, he's got a whole galaxy of satellites he's putting up that are meant to provide high-speed Wi-Fi internet globally at a very cheap cost.
Yes, that's right. Well, in Australia, of course, and probably and definitely in the United States as well, our Bureau of Meteorology uses the Himawari 8, which is the geostationary satellite stationed above over the Pacific Ocean. So, I mean, let's think about that. Is there they say this Himawari 8 produces CGI. Hang on a second. What would that actually take for that to be true? The clouds, if you have a look at the weather from the Himawari 8, and then you look up and you see the weather and it's exactly the same. And then the predictions that are made because of that satellite, and then, wow, it actually did rain. It actually happened exactly the way they said it would. And if you have a look at the satellite, it's raining now, and yes, clouds are right over the place where they say it's raining. I mean, is there somebody? Is there a whole team of people somewhere in Japan who are experts at weather, stitching together CGI photographs every 10 minutes? I mean,
it's
why
an
aren't they
impossible task.
It is. It's the same thing with, with all the hurricane tracking. I mean, there are satellites, over the Pacific and over the Atlantic that do the same thing. I mean, track hurricane, track these large storms in real time, and you can see the very extent of where the clouds are, where the rain bands are, and they exactly match the reality of what's going on around us. It is impossible to fake those kind of things.
Exactly.
Yeah, it would seem to me that. Go ahead, Jeff.
Sorry. Yeah, I just wanted to ask Professor Bell, was it not the Himawari 8 that predicted that forest fire before it hit the local town in Australia?
Yes, it did. Yes, but for that, we couldn't have known about it. And so now the Himawari 8, because Australia is very prone to forest fires, to bushfires, and so this satellite is vital for us to be able to pinpoint where these fires are exactly.
Saved a lot of lives, I think.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
It would seem to me that in order to fake the pictures coming from Himawari, it would take thousands of meteorologists, graphic artists, and computer programmers in constant communication around the world in order to fake those pictures. That to do just the one job that one satellite does would be an inordinate amount of man hours in order to accomplish. And as before we move on for more of this conversation, I'd like to turn to Amy once again and see what's going on inside the live chat. Amy?
Oh, absolutely. I have a question. I have a comment from John Rapp who says, off the top of my head, I would think that a lot of deniers have little knowledge outside of their narrow and close worlds. Rocket science is unbelievable to them. 9 o'clock Hero says, it may help a few of those on the fence, but it doesn't work on the real stupid. For that, you need bricks. And then Gerard says, just wait until the SpaceX Starlink constellation is in place. It'll be pretty hard to deny satellites then. Ugly German Truth says the deniers will pick headlines about helium shortages as we use it, and more in cooling important technological stuff like MRI magnets, and claim, see, all satelloons, while ignoring that a balloon cannot get anywhere near high enough for the area a satellite can serve, or is never fast enough for the observed satellite movements. And then John Rapp says, what was Sputnik? Approximately 50 centimeters in diameter, and that was 1957. How far away could you see that? And Ugly German Truth says, I'm not sure about optical observation of Sputnik, but they definitely had it trigonometrically locked with ham radio on its first few orbits. And then our own Taddy Bogle says, what has been the biggest advance in delivering satellites into orbit? And then I have a couple more here. I'm not. Ugly German Truth said, "I'm not sure about optical observation of Sputnik, but they, I already read that. Sorry." And then John Rapp said, "I forgot about the radio tracking. It gave out a signal-timed pulse, didn't it?" And then Where's Wally had a video cross-referencing the Himawari feed with his local weather, and it came out exactly correct.
Yeah.
So there was that as well.
Yeah. I think one of the problems is that so they can casually say something like the Himawari 8 pictures are just CGI. They can casually say that because they don't have enough education to realize what it would actually take for something like that to actually happen. For, like you said, the need for thousands of meteorologists, for thousands of cartographers and all of that. They can't actually picture that that kind of need. If they did, then surely they would be saying, well, that doesn't make sense. There wouldn't be those people. It's a bit like them saying they guarding the Antarctica with the military. I'm thinking, how much military will you need to guard 93,000 kilometers, which is what it would be
yes.
If you. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Mike, did you want to pop in there?
Yeah, I was thinking that it literally, logistically speaking, it literally would be more difficult of a task to fake something like the Himawari 8 than actually have the satellite take the pictures. It is literally harder to do, and that makes it near impossible.
Yeah, and one of the specific conspiracy claims is that satellites are nothing more than high altitude balloons, and they point to something that Google tried to do a while back, which was just meant to be a low cost option by launching some transmitter type balloons for their internet service. I don't know what really came of that idea or whether or not it was successful, but how would you show some of the satellite deniers that, yes, these are real satellites, they're not really balloons, and here's why?
Well, the one thing they need to understand is that A satellite dish, it's an antenna, but it's a directional antenna. As a matter of fact, the one that's on my roof right now, if I were to go up there and I were to just tweak its elevation, its azimuth, or its tilt by a degree, maybe 2 degrees tops, I would lose all my signal.
Yeah.
So that shows that there is a fixed point in space that the dish is pointing at that is the source of the transmissions to it. So if it is something like towers or balloons or something, they should be able to go from that point where my dish is to the point where that tower is, and nobody can find those things don't exist. Not to mention that if the earth were flat, all of those dishes are pointing in vastly different directions. None of their lines of sight actually intersect, so they would have to be individual towers or balloons or whatever it is. I've also heard troposcatter transmissions. Whatever it happens to be, there would literally be tens of thousands of those, and there's no way to hide that kind of thing. And what do you do about all those dishes that are pointed over oceans, pointing to the geostationary satellites? Those, where would you put a tower in the middle of the Pacific Ocean? So the alternate definition, the alternate sources of transmissions that flat earthers tend to want to use just make no practical sense whatsoever, and it's hard to convince them of that.
Well,
Right, and where I live, the DirecTV satellite dishes are pointed at 46 degrees elevation. That would be one really huge tower for me to be able to not see that tower and have my dish pointed at that elevation.
And in Dish Network, depending upon what package you have, sometimes they actually need 2 dishes on their roof.
Yeah.
In order to be able to get all the transmissions they're looking for.
Yeah. If you want to address the actual balloon thing itself directly, a simple Google would tell them, oh, how long does a balloon last? And they'll find that on average about anywhere from 2 to 24 hours. So how many balloons must they be launching with $100 million worth of satellite attached to it? I mean, that's just preposterous. And what tethers the balloon in one spot so that it can work as a geostationary satellite? Why doesn't the balloon just float around the place like you'd expect it to in air currents? I mean, why isn't that a question they're asking themselves about these balloons?
Yeah. And even if that balloon was tethered to the ground, to be high enough to perform its function, it's still going to have miles of sway.
Exactly, and what would be the mass of this cable that would be necessary to hold that up, and the forces involved? It would have to be at least be a steel cable of considerable dimension to be able to reach that high. I mean, just the physics alone would make that impossible.
Yeah. And I think as far as balloons are concerned, the UHAB, the ultra high altitude balloon, the highest recorded altitude has been just under 50 miles. I don't think that's high enough to really be effective in any way.
No, absolutely not. And the thing about it is that they're so vulnerable. They first of all, they can't go out of the atmosphere. Now, I guess we have to deal with this issue of this dome, and we somehow have to put that to rest too, because one of the things that they do say is, well, they can't be satellites because there's a dome there. So I think that's obviously that's something to be you'd have to knock that on the head as well.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I was just getting ready to go there, and one of the pieces of evidences that I look at, or that I like to use with the non-existence of a dome, is geothermal activity. If we actually had an enclosed system with a dome that you cannot penetrate, just the action of volcanoes would make the atmosphere completely poisonous in something like 100 years or so?
And if you're a creationist, it's had 6,000 years in order to do that with.
I'd like to know from Mike, what would be the impact to the U.S. Navy alone if we lost our satellite network?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, most ships navigate via the military GPS system. They would have to use alternate methods, and actually sextants and other optical means do exist on Navy vessels. They still have to carry all that equipment just in case. Most of launch capability of missiles, cruise missiles, ICBMs don't rely on those, but they have to know where they start in space. So once they launch, they can go from there. But yeah, there is heavy reliance on not just the Navy, but almost every military service in the U.S. and throughout the world on those positioning satellites. Even weapon systems that are independent after launch still have to have that precision location to start with. The military wouldn't be able to work the way it does without it.
Exactly.
And of course, there's the Earth observation satellites collecting any amount of data on climate, on fish stocks, on plankton, you name it, on the tectonic plates moving. The list goes on and on of data that's collected by satellites that could not be collected any other way.
And there's another situation coming up too. I mean, this is one that's going to be sort of a death knell for anybody's denying space, and it really is not that far off, and that is space tourism. Little kids with their "I orbited the Earth" T-shirts a couple of decades from now are going to put the final nail in this space denying coffin.
Oh, I agree. And it's going to happen. I can see it.
Absolutely. Because it's going to be big money to be made by a commercial enterprise to be able to do those kind of things. So it's coming.
Yeah. I think, though, you're quite right. I think that'll probably knock most of it out. But unfortunately, I think there'll still be this cult that no matter what you tell them, they will not they'll not budge.
Oh yeah, I completely agree that there's going to be those that will still deny to the end. I've actually had discussions with people that are flat earth conspiracists, and they're convinced that such things will be nothing but CGI and very sophisticated Disney-like rides, and it just doesn't really make any sense, but they're gonna cling to that for as long as they can.
Yeah, we saw the same thing with the theory of evolution when Darwin first wrote his Origin of Species. There was a huge furor over denial of it. And in the intervening years, even though more and more evidence has been collected that this is true, excuse me, there are still those who say, no, man was created. Certain ideas just will not die.
Yeah. Absolutely. But
Yeah,
also,
I mean,
I think a lot of the misunderstandings of these deniers is their simple lack of education to understand what's going on. So I thought maybe it might be helpful if both of you could kind of give us a little insight into what it takes to put a satellite into space from the launch pad to its final orbit.
Okay. Well, first of all, a lot of money. That's one thing, and a huge list of personnel. Now, so a satellite is basically a rocket is basically built up on the launch pad. So the bits of it are carried there. The final one, which is the payload, which is so fairings are the payloads attached. Satellites are actually attached to spring-loaded brackets, if you like, and then and in our case a camera as well, which is ironic. They actually can see this thing happening, and then the fairings, the two halves of the fairings are fitted. Then this is then carried over to a launch pad, put on the top of the rocket, which may have 3 stages. Each of these stages having their own engines and their own source of fuel, their own oxidizer to get up there. And then you're talking about a controlled explosion of enormous magnitude. We would be about a kilometer away, at least, from this launch pad, and it feels like an earth tremor, like an earthquake going off, and you can actually feel the heat from that. Now that is even though, see, a rocket sits on top of a launch pad, and the launch pad actually has a lot of space underneath it. And this space underneath it is so that the heat and the exhaust can go into this space underneath it. There's even water to cool it down. So we're trying to get rid of all of this heat, and despite all of that, you can still feel this for miles. So it's an incredible amount of energy that goes into that. When you've got it up there, you now have a situation where it could be in a transit orbit, most likely is. So this is an elliptical orbit. You now have you've dropped off your stages of the rocket, and finally you release the spring load that lets go of the satellite or satellites, because there could be many. So payloads don't always carry one satellite; they might have many satellites, and then these are then released, and then somebody from the ground then has to now control this satellite to make sure it's situated correctly. So they now have to go back to calculations, for instance, Kepler's law, Newton's other calculations, to make sure that this satellite is situated perfectly, because its distance is important. Its distance determines its speed. So the further away it is, the slower that the satellite goes. And if you want it to be in geostationary orbit, therefore you want it to be to have a that T to be 24 hours. That's once every 24 hours. So it's got to follow the Earth. Then it's got to be a very, very specific distance away. Now, how are you going to know where it is? That's pretty difficult. You need laser, pulse laser to be able to find out. It is a very, very difficult job. And every now and then there can be decay. That's got to be taken care of. This is a full-time job, just monitoring this thing, let alone getting it up in the first place.
And to think that happens on a weekly basis around the world.
Absolutely. On a weekly basis, yes.
And I should point out to our audience that Dr. Bill isn't just pulling that description out of thin air. He actively works in the satellite industry. And without ruining the thread of our conversation here, Amy's been poking me in the ribs to let me know she has some really good comments in the live chat. So I'm going to turn this over to Amy for a moment.
Sure, thank you. Thank you. I have a question from our own Taddy Bogle, who asks, how would having a non-terrestrial launching station, i.e. the moon, affect the size of satellites we could launch? John Rapp says, how could GPS ever possibly work if it was floating in the atmosphere? And BM Furhall says,
fantastic.
BM Furball says, I've launched 2 balloons with my kids. If NASA was afraid of me finding the dome, why didn't men in black suits show up at my door? Ugly
Yeah.
German Truth says, is answering Taddy Bubble's questions. He said you'd have the problem of getting stuff up there to have something to launch. But yes, starting from the moon would make a lot of things out of orbit easier to achieve. E.g., we could build a space elevator with existing technology for the moon's lower gravity. Digital Demonic Davros says line of sight would be screwed if satellites were in the atmosphere. 9 o'clock Hero says not to mention the pressure we would be under if there was a dome. Ugly German Truth says the moon is a good launch site for anything going not to Earth orbit. If you want to go back to Earth, you increase the need for hardware again. Gerard says some flat earthers will say that the dome is actually reflecting signals broadcast from Earth, so it appears like they are coming from space. Grace Keep It Together asks, a little late on topic, but about Mars. Anyone know how long it took for the rovers to get there some years ago? And Ugly German Truth says, but in the end, they will have to capitulate from the easily accessible information and have to move into their own web or completely offline again. You cannot recruit kids online for everything. And then he said, it's slightly different for each mission, but Curiosity, for example, was on the way for about 280 days or 9.5 months. And then John Rapp just asked, Logic and Reason, Mr. Bell, were you ever a fan of the early sci-fi like Buck Rogers' Forbidden Planet? I do not cry every time when Robbie sacrifices himself.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. Look, that first question was a fantastic question, and that one about
Yes.
whether or not you'd have the Belter launch stuff off the moon. So there's a
Yes.
few problems with that, and there's some actually good ones with that. There's actually quite a bit of a race going on to get to the moon at the moment, to actually put a station on the moon. So this quite a few private and government agencies are trying to do that, and of course, you know, the American Orion project is about doing that itself. And the reason for that is the likelihood that there'll be sufficient ice that will allow them to actually create fuel and other things that they'll need. So when you think about the cost of water on the moon, so every kilogram is about $36,000. Which is strange because flat earthers can tend to ask us, why don't you have cameras here and cameras there and do this and do that? I think every time we think about putting 1 single kilogram up there, we have to think about spending $36,000. Now, we all pretty much know that the Earth is a sphere. So imagine trying to justify spending, say 5 kilograms worth of camera and the like, just to show flat Earth people that the Earth is in fact not as and is not flat.
Yeah, and when it costs $36,000 per kilogram for a payload, the $50 million a day that the conspiracy theorists complain about for the NASA budget, that doesn't go very far.
No, it doesn't.
Yeah, and it is significant too. I mean, DirecTV's last 4 satellites that they put up in orbit, from construction of the satellite to launch, cost about $1.8 billion.
Yes.
That's the costs involved are huge, and this money is being spent. And if not to launch the satellites, where is $100 billion money going?
Yeah, exactly. So, this is a question that bugs me. I'm thinking, all right, so you flat Earth people say that we go through all the trouble of this huge controlled explosion, and up goes a rocket, and then somehow it goes down into the sea. I'm not sure where they think ours goes, but they say the American one goes into the Bermuda Triangle. So let's forget about all that money. What do we tell our clients? Because I mean, we're not launching satellites for ourselves. So the PSLV, which is the Polar Satellite Launch Vehicle, C series. So for instance, C, we're up to like C46. That C means commercial. So we're actually it's other people's satellites that we're launching, not our own. What do we tell our customers? Oh, we dumped your satellite in the Pacific Ocean. How silly is that? I'm sorry, I have to laugh. That is just so silly.
I don't think you're the only one who has to laugh.
Yeah. What kind of commercial clients does your agency service? If it's possible that I can ask that question.
Sure. Well, I'd say commercial ones. Obviously, there's military satellites, but the commercial ones would be television, internet, various communications, lots and lots of scientific stuff, climate, weather, and then universities, offering their satellites because they want their type of experiment to go ahead. So there's so many different experiments in physics, in chemistry, in biology, that require these satellites. Like I said, for instance, just monitoring where the plankton are. So they want to know where the plankton are. They can track whales. All of those sort of things can be done by satellites. In fact, are done by satellites. So
a little off topic, but with all of the advancements we've made in satellite technology and getting them up there, what are some of the ancillary technologies that have benefited the world because of it?
Look, metals, the communications that we have. There's so many different things that we've learned how to do better. Better Wi-Fi, better assembling of communications packets, better use of microwave. There's so many different, just little things that are then adopted, for practical stuff on Earth that comes from learning how that worked on a satellite.
Yeah.
And even closer to home than that, correct me if I'm wrong, gentlemen, but the advancements and discoveries that are made by the world's space agencies also translates into the products that we use here in our homes. The flat screen TVs, the internet routers, the microwave ovens, our cars, our telephones. If it wasn't for the advancements of these space agencies, these other technologies would not also be advancing.
Yeah, it's because a need produces them for the space agency. So very specific needs. So they say, look, we've got a problem that we must solve. So how do you get these two things to stick together? Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Guess what? Somebody invents Velcro.
I think one of the toughest questions I've ever had to answer from one of my grade 3 students was, what can I be when I grow up? And I can't answer that, because when they're old enough to go out into the workforce after university, there's going to be so many jobs available to them that we can't even imagine existing right now. How do you answer that question?
Yeah. And they're going to be they're going to be in science and technology. And one of the problems is there's people who want to deny that the Earth is a sphere and deny science as a result of that. They're bringing up children, and we're struggling as it is to get people in STEM. We're struggling to get women in STEM. We're struggling to get people in general into STEM subjects. So, we're just going to run out of engineers. The people. I've got to retire sometime. There's not enough people to take our place.
And I haven't heard from Mike for a little bit, and I really don't want him feeling left out. He's such a wonderful guest to be returning to our show time after time. I was sitting there wondering through the course of this conversation, Mike, I know you design Navy ships as an engineer. How difficult would it be for you to transfer your skills to the space agencies? And are you even remotely interested in that sort of thing professionally?
What do you mean by transfer? You talk about just going
Yeah,
from doing what I'm
to
doing
move.
now. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, from an engineering standpoint, there basically it would not be that difficult of a transfer. There would be a learning curve to specific application of those skills. I would think, because I'm not up on the latest orbital mechanics kind of data, so I'd have to relearn some of that stuff. But yeah, it is translatable. The other thing too, some of the stuff that Amy just brought up in her latest collection of comments. Let's see. I was trying to take notes here. One of the things that was coming up about bouncing off the dome. Again, the satellite dishes, they're directional. They have to maintain a specific direction, so that doesn't work. So those types of explanations that keep coming up really have no basis in reality.
Yeah, and also when we talk about transferring to these new technologies from older technologies, when you think about it, as you mentioned before, Mike, space tourism, it's going to be a real thing, and it's not that far off. How many of the world's airlines are going to need pilots qualified to fly orbital passenger craft? That's a whole new set of avionics.
Right, and that's gonna be interesting. The number of new types of jobs that are going to be created by such an industry. It's going to be rather impressive to see how that grows and how that works, and how, I don't know how many people are going to have qualified to right off the bat to put commercial passengers into low Earth orbit. That's gonna be an interesting extension of job skills.
Yeah, Virgin Galactic is working on it right now.
Yep.
Yeah, I think they're going to go just to the edge of space, so there'll probably be about 100 kilometers, and there's a number of practical reasons for that, and that is re-entering the atmosphere is a pretty daunting thing to do with people on board. What you have to do in a place like that is look at risk. And imagine if, let's say, a risk of 1 in a million, and you said if the risk of being involved in an airline accident was, say, 1 in 100,000, nobody would fly. They probably wouldn't fly if it was 1 in a million. Turns out it's about 1 in 11 million chance of getting killed in an accident. Which is it'll happen, but it's pretty remote. But when you're looking at something like being up in just over the atmosphere now, dealing with re-entry and stuff like that, we have there's considerably more risk involved in that sort of thing. So taking it beyond 100 kilometers, I would think would pose a significant percentage higher risk. So I would say that they'll probably stick within just within the range of the atmosphere, so that it's not too difficult to get back.
And Amy has been poking me in the background. I think I'm going to get some bruised ribs. She forgets that I'm an old, frail man at the time, sort of. But anyway, I'm going to turn it over to her to get some comments from our live chat.
Sure. Ugly German Truth says, I think someone calculated the payroll of NASA alone would add up to $17 billion a year for a reasonable average engineer salary, about half of the total annual expenses. And he also said, I've heard one of the biggest effects space exploration had was the dire need for better energy supplies and better computing power, both of which kickstarted the consumer market developments like lithium ion batteries or modern computers. And then John Rapp says, we spend too much money on NASA and other science related industries. We don't spend a fraction of enough money on our future as a species, approximately 10 to the minus 17th power percent. um,
Oh, why did I know that
Ugly-
was going to come up?
yeah, exactly. um, Ugly German Truth says, doesn't aerospace as a whole have a positive return on investments through creating the whole components, industries, schools, and all that needed to fulfill its requirements and pays back like $3 for each dollar spent on it? And then BM Furball says, how many different groups are currently building something they expect to end up in space? That would not work if space science was fraudulent. And Ugly German Truth says again, not to forget that it brings us satellite TV, telephones, GPS, weather forecasts, and all the air travel we could ever want. And then John Rapp says to Ugly German Truths, I think you are very likely correct. They would have to be to survive as a business. I was going for a counter to Flurf's continually spouting on about NASA's budget.
Yes. Well, as far as NASA, I don't exactly know how many people they employ, but I can tell you that they'd be working pretty close to the bones with their costs, knowing what it costs to put rockets in space and stuff like that. I don't think they'd be taking home much profit.
Yeah, I think also NASA is really a drop in the bucket compared to the worldwide space agency budgets. I mean, I think there's currently 74 different space agencies operating. About a dozen or so, 16 or so have satellite launch capability. 4 have the capability of getting to the moon. So, what NASA's budget is a minuscule drop in a bucket compared to the rest of what the world is also spending.
That's absolutely correct. Yeah, and there's so much going into research and development because of the space race. I don't think the flat Earth people understand how how fast that's going at the moment. I think they just assume a rocket gets launched once every year or once every few years. They might hear about one, but now it's so mundane it doesn't make the news. It's just an everyday event.
And I think a lot of them have lost sight of the absolute dependence the world has on that technology now, as opposed to 50 years ago.
Yes, absolutely.
True.
Yeah.
Absolutely true.
Yeah, I think it's a shame that the general public has kind of lost the amazement about what goes on in the space programs. And that's actually been kind of an old problem. Back even during the Apollo missions in the early 70s, people were already losing interest, wanting to move on to the next big thing. And they actually tried to say on the news, I think during Apollo 14, that going to the moon has become routine. And personally, I don't think there's anything routine about anything that any of the space agencies do.
No.
Absolutely not. It is so easy to fail. As you know, the Chandrayaan-2 mission, Indian mission, failed. The orbit worked fine, but then the final the lunar lander did make it to the moon, but unfortunately was still traveling around 50 meters per second when it was only about 500 meters off the ground. So,
and correct me if I'm wrong, this also shows how complicated this business really is, that they have yet to determine what failed. Yes? No?
Yeah, exactly. That's so there's some meetings being held, in a couple of weeks' time, and that will be looking specifically at what did fail. It's very hard to tell. I mean, the thing about the telemetry is that you've got to be so accurate. You've got to be, microsecond on top of it, because otherwise you've got no chance to make any changes. If you let's say, for instance, you only get the signal, 10 seconds or 15 seconds after an event has happened, a crucial event, there just isn't any time for you to actually make any decisions to save the craft. It would actually be better if there was a human on board the craft, a pilot. So when you look back at say, they'll say, well, it's so complicated. They managed to do this in 1969. They managed to put a craft on the moon in 1969. Now in 2019, they're crashing the craft, on the moon. The Israelis crashed one, the Indians have crashed one, and when you look back then, they had a pilot. So the pilot knows that there's something going wrong, that some adjustment has to be made. If you haven't got the telemetry back in the nick of time, you just can't make those things. You just got to. You say, right, okay, everything's in place, the velocity's right. Let's just cross our fingers and hope the next time we hear from the craft, it's on the ground safely.
Yeah.
Sometimes it isn't.
There's no restart button.
Right. It's very likely that the first lunar lander, if it had to have been automated, may not have actually landed correctly and would have crashed.
Exactly.
It is Neil Armstrong, and that the man on the stick that made that all work.
That's why they did 10 missions to test everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, the distances and the speeds involved, the few seconds delay between the Earth and the moon to the spacecraft that's landing can make a huge, huge difference. People don't realize how fast things happen.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's true. And like I said before, you miss a second. A second is too much. Something's happened. You needed to make a decision, and you couldn't because you didn't know. This is just a signal. We're relying on signals coming from 250,000 miles away, 230,000 miles away, and it can go wrong. It breaks down. The signal breaks down. I mean, every now and then you get a glitch on the TV from a satellite. You've lost a signal just for a second. That doesn't seem to bother you, but if you were trying to control a spacecraft, that would be a serious problem.
Yeah. We sit there in awe when we watch something like a SpaceX satellite go up and everything just comes off perfectly without a hitch, right on time, no problems. And we say, oh, wow, that's so cool. But we never stop to think the years of testing and development it took to get there.
Yes, absolutely right. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, some of these programs have taken decades out of people's lives, and the designing and the production and the testing, not even thinking about the amount of time it takes to operate a mission.
Some of these satellites take 10 years to build. Okay. So from the ground up, with all the building in their new technology, can take 10 years. It's an 11-year project that failed on the moon. So imagine that, 11 years of work. So that's for some people that's their career. 11 years, and then it didn't work.
That's heartbreaking.
It is, but it's also, how much did you learn from that experience?
Absolutely, it's never a fail. So failure is not a waste. It's never a waste, because if you've learned something, it's what not to do. That's just as valuable as what to do.
Yeah. Failure is a prerequisite for success.
You must, yes, exactly. If you're not failing, you're not trying.
and hopefully
And
learning from it.
yeah. And Amy, is there anything going on in the live chat that we need to know about?
Actually, there is. I have some great comments here and some good questions and everything. Ugly German Truth says, I think somebody calculated the. Did I read that one before?
Yeah.
Yeah, I did. Sorry. But I did have some other good ones. It brings us satellite TVs, telephones, GPS, weather forecasts, and all the. Yeah, and I read that one too. I'm very sorry. Early morning.
No
Grace,
worries, no
keep it
worries.
together. Thank you. Grace, keep it together says rather concerning about how much we rely on tech. If a virus came about, not many will know how to go manual or Walmart crashed. And then Digital Demonic Davros says my biggest issue is that the ignorant people use GPS and Google Earth, yet say the Earth is flat and sats are fake. Hypocrisy.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Oh, it drives me crazy every time I see a conspiracy theorist video that's using Google Earth, spinning spinning the globe around to show different points on the globe while saying that the Earth is flat.
Yeah.
Yeah, with discussing their dome, it'd probably be worth. One of the things they say about the satellites is we can't have a satellite because you can't have a pressure zone next to a vacuum. So this is their big thing. The other thing is how do rockets get around in the vacuum of space? They forget that about Newton's third law. But with that very first one that I mentioned, what they don't understand is that the atmosphere starts, at 101 kilopascals at the ground, and then is graduated all the way to practically nothing. But actually, the difference between nothing and 101 kilopascals is not that big. And by the time it gets up there, so why would you need a barrier up there if there's this graduation? So less and less concentration of the gas, less and less molecules until there's practically none. There's absolutely no reason to need a barrier. And if you want evidence from that, at 101 kilopascals, you can boil the water at 100 degrees. As you get to the top of Mount Everest, you could boil the water at 70 degrees. It goes to show that not only is the pressure difference, but the actual amount of molecules in the air is different. If it wasn't, you wouldn't need oxygen tanks up at the top of Mount Everest. So this goes on and on and on until there's practically nothing. You don't need to have a barrier. You didn't need to have a barrier between sea level and the top of Mount Everest. Why would you need a barrier between Mount Everest and the rest of it?
Exactly.
Well, I think
Good
what they're
point.
doing is they're trying to conflate the idea that what is next to space is the 14.7 psi that we have down at sea level, and it's not. It's such a minuscule number as to be almost non-existent.
Yeah, just a few molecules per cubic meter.
Yeah, well, and to pull a term out of Nathan Oakley's book, they presuppose that gravity doesn't exist. It's the only way for them to make any sort of assertions about there having to be a container of some sort, such as a dome, because otherwise gas wouldn't stay where it is. They want gravity to go away, so they just ignore it completely.
Yeah.
And they also forget that if this was an enclosed container and Pascal's law was in effect, that we would not have a pressure gradient to begin with.
Correct.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. In fact, if there wasn't, there couldn't possibly be a pressure gradient because there is this source of heat that would in the 6,000 years, if you're a creationist, would have most definitely heated up all of the gas beyond any point there that any living creature could live in it.
Exactly.
I mean, Blue Marble Science proved it's possible in his front yard with a tube and a pressure meter. I mean,
yeah, I love that experiment. That was
I love it too. And it was so simple to do, wasn't it, Mike? So simple.
Absolutely. And and yet still people denying, and moving that goalpost.
Yeah, one of the things I find interesting is that the conspiracy theorist will complain about having to rely or defer to someone else's knowledge and authority. But personally, I don't see anything wrong with that, especially in an age of specialization. I can do experiments like we were just talking about with blue marble science, and I can do several of them. And so what comes to my mind is if I can do these and I can show in my own backyard or my own kitchen that this is true, it is reasonable to provisionally assume that this other experiment that I cannot recreate is provisionally true. I defer to somebody else's authority all the time. Every time I walk into my doctor's office, every time I turn the engine on in my car to go down to the market, I'm deferring to somebody else's authority.
Correct. Yeah. And that's one of the things that I find so annoying. Because you guys brought it up on the show last night that basically somebody would have to start with proving that they can make fire to proving internal combustion engines. They'd have to do all the steps in between if they don't defer to someone else's authority.
Well, why do they trust them with all the other stuff? I mean, they do they not? For instance, they'd say, "Well, you need to see things with your own eyes." Well, where is the flatty who's actually seen a hydrogen and an oxygen molecule, and yet they put them together and that makes water? Maybe they don't believe that hydrogen and oxygen makes water.
Well, I think Pete don't.
Yeah, but at the same time, we can fill a flask with hydrogen and oxygen and apply heat, and voila, we all of a sudden have liquid water.
Yes, exactly right. So, and speaking of gravity, they seem to think that maybe that the molecules of gas don't have mass. And that we actually had a prime minister, believe it or not, who actually said that once in an election campaign. He's an anti a climate change denier, and he said, "Well, CO2 doesn't weigh anything," until somebody said, "Well, get a block of dry ice and drop it on your foot, then come back and tell us if CO2 doesn't."
Yeah, and I think. Go ahead, Jeff.
They seem to have such a problem with science in general, and yet they place all of their trust in the internet to deliver their silliness, and they wouldn't have that if it wasn't for science.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right, and one of the things I hear these folks telling me is that they think that I believe everything that NASA or the Ivory Tower scientists tell me. And what they don't understand is that as a science-minded individual, as a skeptic, because I have done these experiments, like I said a moment ago, I accept that this that I cannot recreate is provisionally true, which means until other information comes along to change what I know or think I know, I can accept it as true, provisionally, because things are always in flux. We always find new information that changes. That's why we use the word scientific theory and not really scientific fact so much, because we know that as new information comes along, and there's always more to learn, that those theories will change. But that doesn't mean that they will go away, like the theory of gravity. Gravity's not going away, not anytime soon. But how we understand how gravity works and what it is will change as we progress further and gain more information.
That's the whole point of science is going out there trying to prove themselves wrong and learn from the experience.
Look, the very first thing I say to scientists, to students on their very first day is, there's no truth in science. If we accepted a truth, then what we're basically saying at the most basic level is that we don't need to look anymore. there is nothing more to learn, because truth is limiting. It defines a particular thing at a particular time and says, this is the truth, therefore there is no more. And we know that science changes all the time. You get better and better at it. Even if you accept something, sooner or later, you'll get better precision. Therefore, it's changed. Therefore, you could not have called it truth, because truth is definite. So we don't need
it's
truth and science.
it's a part of life.
Yeah, I usually tell people if they want truth, take a philosophy class.
Yeah. Yes,
You
exactly.
see it everywhere. I mean, Mike, when you're working on a vessel for the U.S. Navy, how many times or how many design changes does that vessel go through before you actually launch it?
Yeah, the changes are incredible. Everything morphs and changes to from what we thought we knew to what is going to wind up happening. Components change. Yeah, but that's typical of any a scientific or engineering endeavor. Though you're always learning more, you're always learning new things, and
Exactly.
the pencils get sharpened. You go out and you do what you need to do to do the analysis, to do the stress work, to make sure everything is what it is. And even after the vessel is designed and built, we're still changing as we go along with new things that we learn and know.
Yeah.
So it doesn't stop even after it's designed.
Yeah. Professor Bell is about to sharpen his pencils to find out what went wrong with the moon landing.
Yes, absolutely. Oh God, that's given that a lot of thought, and still without the actual data, you can speculate, and it's I guess we could say we knew the telemetry at a certain distance, and therefore we can speculate about what's happened to the craft. Well, actually, we can calculate what's happened to the craft. However, why is the big question that still needs to be answered.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And we're sitting at about an hour and 43 minutes runtime on this conversation so far. And unlike the other gentlemen on this panel, I'm retired. I don't have to punch a time clock anytime soon. So I'm going to let the rest of you decide when we need to wrap up and sign off. Don't know how long we have Mike or Dr. Bell with us, but I want to check in with Amy and see what's going on in the live chat before we make that decision whether or not to start wrapping up.
Oh, absolutely. I have some good ones here, too. John Rapp says, see, Dr. Bell gets it. I've been pointing out Flurf illogic, moon and Earth's atmosphere, and so rockets do have something to push on, ergo moon landing very possible. Digital Demonic Davros says, I love gravity. It will never let me go until I reach escape velocity. Andrew Stoll says, I hate how Flurfs won't accept or trust others' experiments, but they trust the speedometer in their cars, don't they? Ugly German Truth says to Andrew Stoll, except for the ones that claim the U.S. is only 50% as big as we were told in school. Digital Demonic Davros comes back and says, the globe deniers don't trust our science or scientists, but Riley and Globebusters do, and they trust them and their pseudoscience. And Andrew Stoll again says, well, I can measure that distance across the country with my speedometer and a watch.
Yeah, exactly. Well, see, one thing I can mention, you mentioned about the rocket and Newton's third law, and they keep saying, well, produce something on Earth that matches that, so that doesn't need to push against anything. And we say, oh, okay, well, what about a bazooka? What does a bazooka do? It's just a tube, and in the middle of it is a firing mechanism. So that firing hits a pin, and off goes the ammunition. At one end goes the exhaust, the other end goes the ammunition. The exhaust is so tiny, how can that thing go for a kilometer or a few kilometers, and this end over here just a puff of smoke? how can that be if Newton's third law didn't work? So a bazooka is a perfect case of Newton's third law in action.
Right, and even when I've seen YouTubers will run an experiment testing a model rocket in a vacuum chamber, the conspiracy will come back and say, well, it's pushing off of the sides of the vacuum chamber, or it's pushing off its own exhaust gases. They can't seem to just accept the fact that the thrust isn't pushing against anything. It is the Newton's third law, equal and opposite motions.
And I said before, actually, one of the things that described that when I described the platform with the space underneath it to try and dissipate all of this energy, you'd think that would be the last thing we'd do if we wanted something, if we wanted this energy to push against the ground, for instance. Why on earth would we try to get rid of it? It's because it's got nothing to do with the thrust. The energy that's released from the thrust means that energy in the other direction is the same. That's Newton's third law. It does not need to push against anything, and certainly doesn't need to push anything against anything in space.
There you go. Question answered.
Yeah.
But amazingly,
Mike?
even though our last episode dealt with rockets working in a vacuum, we still had a conspiracy theorist pop into our comments section trying to argue that we were wrong, even though we were very detailed about it.
Yeah, it doesn't matter the level of detail you provide. A denier is going to deny, no matter what happens.
Yeah. They can't help themselves.
Yeah. Actually, there's something I wouldn't like to. I'd like to say, in case we missed this before we close, and that is, I've said to flat Earth people, look, the flat Earth thing is going to go nowhere. It's going to die unless you can get it some respect. So respect by people like me, respect in academia, and we do respect all sorts of ideas, as wacky as they come. We don't turn people down because of their ideas. We say, okay, bring your ideas, work on your ideas. You have your hypothesis, produce your evidence for it. And I'm happy, and I've said to the flat Earth people, I'll help you to actually go through this process. So I'll tell you what you need to do so that you can be respected by people like me. Now, you've got to answer the tough questions. So you can't just pretend that those questions don't exist. You have to actually try to answer them. Now, obviously, there are things that you won't be able to, that we'll never agree with, because we have all sorts of evidence that the Earth is a sphere. So no one's ever going to say that the Earth isn't a sphere. But along the way, in your discovery, in your hypothesis about the flat Earth, you may come across some very interesting things that we could use. And we'll say, well, okay, we would never have looked at this except for the fact that this person thought the Earth could be flat, and that was their hypothesis. So they've looked at something completely new that we would never have gone that way because we wouldn't for a minute think that the Earth could be flat. So why not answer those tough questions, bring what you have to it, join the community of science, and you may have some great idea that can be adopted or will be respected. Like there's so many things that we do respect when people bring their ideas to physics. We don't turn them away. If we did turn them away, Einstein wouldn't have had a Guernsey, because Einstein came with his way out theories back in the early 1900s. And luckily enough for him, universities were saying, wow, that is pretty wacky, but we'll give it a go, Mr. Einstein. And he certainly did. That's how science works.
Yeah, and that's the problem I've been having in my conversation with conspiracy theorists in general, is that they have putting so much energy into trying to disprove the globe that they're not putting any energy to show any evidence for their own ideas. And when I ask them the questions that you were just asking, they just kind of hand wave everything else away as just, we're pseudoscientists, and then leave it at that. But they don't seem to understand that even if you could disprove the globe, that doesn't necessarily mean flat. It could, it could be a donut, it could be many other things. Why is it flat? What's the evidence that points in that direction seems to escape the grasp?
Yeah. Time after time, that's exactly what we run into in discussions with flat earthers, is that they don't tend to present any evidence in support of their claims. It's always attempting to attack something else, like saying gravity doesn't exist, or the fact that space doesn't exist, those kind of things.
I'd like to expand a little bit on what Professor Bella said. Flat earthers, yes, they need to ask those difficult questions and answer those difficult questions, but they must also be willing to accept the answers whether they like them or not, and that's the problem. If it doesn't suit them, they deny them.
Yeah, and that's because, frankly, they're not interested in the truth. They're not interested in the facts, should I say. They because the fact undoes this. If they had the self-actualization in Maslow's hierarchy, they now have gone down a peg or two, okay, for that reason. This is very hard for them to let go of and say, no, I'm not going to give up my good feeling about knowing stuff that you don't know. So whatever evidence you bring to me, I'm just going to simply discount it. And I think that's what's going on there. Now, there are, though, the people who I think, it's my opinion, based on where I'm listening to them, these people at the top of it, the gurus, if you like, of the flat earth, if you want to call them that, these people are not actually believers of flat earth. And one of the ways it's easy to tell is because they ask questions in a way that they could not possibly have understood that to ask that question if they didn't actually know what the problem was. For instance, like trying to explain night and day, and how does how does half the Earth shine and half of it's in darkness on a flat Earth? Do you have a magic lampshade, for instance? Does the sun have a magic lampshade? We can't see it. It looks round when you look at it, but when it shines on the Earth, it manages to shine in a semicircle. How does it do that? And how do the people who are near this semicircle on the dark side of it, who are much, much closer than the people, towards the edge of it, why can't they see the sun? I mean, these are very, very basic things. But, even at that level, the flat earth people will think, well, I don't want to answer that question. I don't want to even address that question. So I'm just going to say to you that your question isn't based in science because you didn't wiggle this, or you didn't wiggle the x-axis or something like that. So they will now argue some pedantic thing about the terminology of science, while this huge elephant about how does night and day work is standing right in the room next to them. And then they expect to be respected.
Right.
Sorry,
And we are
Elizabeth.
at an hour and 55 minutes runtime, and I do not want to abuse our guests' generosity with their time. So I think at this time we'll go back to Amy for some final comments from the live chat, and we can then start a wrap up, and get on with the rest of the day or evening, whichever applies.
I agree with that.
Sounds good,
Okay.
Logical.
It's right on midnight.
Yes. Exactly. Okay, I have some really good comments here. Um, Ugly German Truth says they want to be just like a scientist so much. Cue the mummery with Riley or JM donning a lab coat and posing as doing experiments that ends up looking as real as Muppet Show sketches. Um,
True.
what about Nixon's space call? You know they directed the phone to a radio and vice versa for the voices of the astronauts.
Okay.
And you basically do the same every time that you use a mobile phone. Microphone goes to radio, radio goes to another phone and is put out over a loudspeaker. No magic to it. And one of the best comments of the day that we have right here is Ugly German Truths again says, reality is under no obligation to make sense to you.
That's very true.
That is a good comment.
That's a good closing one. That, yeah. I think I think to finish off my part of it is I still have this olive branch. I will help a flat earther anytime. Say, look, let's have a look at this, and if you want me to look at this from an academic's point of view, and give it the respect. In other words, I want to take it seriously. Then I have a few questions for you. You need to answer them.
Very good, Mike.
I think that what we've talked about today is a really good discussion of space and satellites, and there is so much about it that is so easily verifiable. I think we've shown that. The question is, how many people will start to see what we see, start to understand what we understand?
Let's hope the fence sitters do.
Yes, let's hope they do, and that's really mostly my goal.
Yeah.
Yeah, mine as well. And Jeff, what about you? Final thoughts?
I think our discussion today has been very productive, and I think we probably have reached a few of the fence sitters. And really, ultimately, that's, I think, what this channel is all about. And I just want to thank both of our guests for their incredible participation and just an awesome conversation. Thank you, gentlemen.
And before I give my wrap up, I'll turn to Amy and Teddy Bogle. Amy, do you have any final thoughts on our discussion tonight?
Oh my gosh, this was absolutely amazing. I'm just in awe of it was an interesting conversation. And I want to thank both our guests today for coming on, and I want to thank everybody in the audience for coming and joining in the conversation. And so thank you to everybody. It was just incredible. And thank you for letting me be a part of it.
Thank you for letting me be a part of it too. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I hope that the little that I had was a good contribution to helping some of the fence sitters not fall into this cult.
The little that he adds, he says, I love the humility of educated professionals like that. Teddy Bogle, what do you have to say to us?
I cannot believe that that's 2 hours gone, man. That has absolutely flown by. The conversation has just been fantastic, man. I've been laughing this up from start to finish. Oh, brilliant. Brilliant. Thank you very much to two of you for coming on and talking about this. And once again, Logical, Stephen Cup, and Amy, fantastic job, man.
Yes, that time definitely flew by when you're having fun. It's amazing how that happens. I wonder if we can find some sort of mathematical equation to explain that. But anyway, I really appreciate Dr. Bill coming on and Mike Bertelson for joining us. And to our audience in the live chat, thank you so much for all of your participation and helping to drive our conversation forward. And unless there's any unforeseen changes in Dr. Bill's schedule, we will be returning on November 17th at 11 a.m. GMT for a conversation about the conspiracy claim that the moon landings were faked. Before we sign off, the only thing I'll say is it's been a great conversation. If you're not sure about how something works, look into it. Do some research. Read a book. Don't take a YouTuber's point of view as gospel. Find out for yourself. And with that, we'll say good night.
Good night. Thank you very much.
Good night, everyone.
So long, everyone.
Good night, everyone. Thank you for
Good night,
coming.
everyone. Thank you so much, and good morning.
Good night, audience.